Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message.
Over the centuries, the Jewish leaders, teachers of the law would debate among themselves which is the greatest commandment in the Bible. They would go back and forth and maybe in one era focus on one particular commandment over another. But I want to move aside to that. Did you know that in the Old Testament there are, by some counts, 613 commandments? And I know some of you are going, wait a second, I thought we were talking about 10. I struggle with 10. What are we going to do with 613? And so 613 is really kind of expounding on, explaining, and applying the 10. So the 10 commandments are really kind of the core, a synopsis of all of that God had intended. But at least as you have that in the back of your mind, you'll realize then later on in the New Testament, when Jesus is approached by a teacher of the law and he's asked the question, teacher, which is the greatest commandment? You'll realize that that's part of the debate and the conversation that's going on. But having said that, I want to put that aside for a second. I want you to understand that the Bible is not all about commandments. In fact, the heart of the Bible is not commandments at all. Commandments, is what we're going to find here this morning, actually stem from relationship. In other words, God is not saying do this or don't do that, and then everything will be good. Rather, it all begins and ends in relationship. I want you to think about it in terms of family. Families don't exist because they follow rules or they have a set of rules. The rule, we don't obey rules for the sake of rules. Rules are in place in a family. The family is already in existence before the rules even come into play. The rules are a way of how to keep the family on track, or how to keep the family healthy and working in a proper manner. And we're going to find that that's God's goal in this relationship as well. And so if you want to follow along on the insert or on the app, I'm going to invite you to do that. And before we even get to our passage, I want to set the foundation for this whole set of commandments by talking about covenant. So take a look. That's the first paragraph at the top here. Covenant is that first word. And a covenant is basically God saying, since I have graciously chosen you, he's talking essentially to Israel, not because of yourselves. He didn't choose Israel because of how good they were. He chose them out of the goodness of his own heart for his own plans. here is how you are to live. Because I've chosen you, here's how you're to live. And as you do so, your lives and your community, the world will be better for it. Moreover, we will remain in close fellowship together. When I talk about covenant, I want you to understand the Old Testament, another word for that is Old Covenant. New Testament is New Covenant. And so the Old Covenant that God had established with his people was a way of approaching. In fact, this was not unusual in the ancient world to have a king approach another king or a nation approach another nation and say, I'll have a relationship with you, and here are the guidelines. Here's what this looks like. And so they understood the idea of a covenant. But with God, this is God initiating a covenant, a relationship with God's people. And he's saying, and within this relationship, here's what it looks like on your behalf. Now, you might ask the question, well, why did God have to give all of these things, these rules? Well, first of all, I want you to think, God's people have been living in slavery for 400 plus years. They don't have any clue about what this God expects. They don't have any sense of understanding until God initiates and says, here's what it looks like. And so when you take it from that, you realize that God is actually making it clear to them, here's how you are to live in relationship to me. So with that as a backdrop, let's go to Exodus 20, beginning in verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So let's just note that before we ever get to commandments, it starts with God revealing himself. And so take a look at your insert. Yahweh, that's the word, he says, I am the Lord, that's the word Yahweh, that's the word that God used to describe, this is my personal name when he talks to Moses from the burning bush. Yahweh is a personal God. In fact, he says, I am your God. I'm your God. The rest of the nations have all of their false gods, but I'm your God. Secondly, he's a God who speaks and acts. So what we see here is this God actually speaks. And not only he does more than speak, he acts on their behalf. And so his deliverance then of Israel from slavery is woven into his very character. In other words, he's the God who delivers and saves. As he reveals his name, he's saying, this is the kind of God I am. I'm the God who delivered you and saved you. That's the kind of God I am. And then thirdly, that he's a God who reveals himself. And here's why it's important. If he had not, we couldn't truly know him. We would need this God to explain, to describe him. Yeah, we could see him in creation, but we couldn't know him personally unless you revealed himself. And the reason this is important is because the God of all creation is a God who wants to be known. Now, I understand there are some that think he's playing hide and seek, and he could sure make it a whole lot easier, and I understand all of that. But at God's heart, he really does want to be known. Now, there are some who don't find God, just like a robber doesn't find a policeman, because the robber doesn't really want to find a policeman. So the truth of the matter, there's some people that don't really want to find God at the heart of it. But having said that, there are some that wrestle with knowing and seeing this God, and God says, continue to seek me, and you will know me. I'll be revealed to you. Let's go to the third verse. And so he begins. After having introduced himself, he says, you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, Israel is to have one God like having one spouse. The phrase to before me is quite literally to my face. And it's also used in a marriage context, that is that while my wife lives, I'm not to have another one. In other words, he's saying this is a relational faithfulness that I am calling you into a relationship with me, and you're not to have any other commitments. In other words, God will not share his glory or his worship with another, Isaiah says. I'll not share my glory with anybody else. And so God is saying, I am to be your only God. And take a look at your insert again. Here's why this matters. It was not to say that there are actually other gods, But in that day, many idols and gods were worshiped by the nations around them. In fact, this is going to be a struggle for Israel until it's finally conquered by Babylon hundreds of years later. You might say, why does God have to lay this out? Because if you read the rest of the story in the Old Testament, you realize that God's people constantly stumbled at this one. They constantly were bringing in the gods of other. In fact, you go just a few chapters later, and they're already going to be making an idol to a calf. They're going to bow down to this God. And so God is saying, I want you to understand, I know your temptation is to want to be like everybody else. And the reason I say that this continues until Babylon is finally God had enough, and he allowed Babylon to come in and take them into exile. And once the people of God end up in exile in Babylon for 70 years, they come back really kind of purified. They don't bow down to other idols. In fact, it was kind of like, all right, God, we realize enough's enough. It's time for us to get serious about this. We're not going to be bringing in other gods or idols. But what would that look like today? What would it look like to have any other gods? And I want you to understand that a God is anything that takes our primary time, our primary focus, our primary treasure and talents, that our energy is driven to this, that becomes a God for us. It doesn't have to be something that's carved or something that we literally bow down to. In fact, in an essay titled The Future of Sport, presented at the 2004 conference of the World Future Society, author and futurist Robin Gunston examines how organized sports will look in years to come. Now, this has nothing to say to Michigan fans or anything. I know you're very excited, and you have every right to be very excited about what happened yesterday. But I want you to listen closely beyond football and other sports as well. He says, the loss of core values in society due to the waning influence of the church creates a spiritual vacuum into which sports may move. Religio sport could develop as major sports replace conventional religion. Religio sport will have its shrines, stadiums, its costumes, uniforms, services, its games and events, its rituals, its chants and songs, and its high priests, star athletes, and its piety or acts of faithfulness, fan loyalty. You realize how something as simple as a sport can also become a god, just as a job can become a god, or another relationship, or whatever it is that, or even addiction that begins to take all of that time and energy and focus. And so those words to God's people some multiple thousands, 3,500 years ago are very relevant today. So look at verse 4. We move on to that second of commandments. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Well, take a look at your insert. We'll kind of break this down together. You see, since idols were everywhere in the nations surrounding them, they were all over the countryside, so to speak, it would be far too easy to become just like their neighbors. And so God is saying, I'm not like those gods. You're not to make me into an image or to make an image that somehow reflects me. And here's why. Because these religions viewed God as magical, able to be manipulated, with limitations, not personal, and they were also quite perverse. And so God is trying to draw distinctions and saying you're not to be like them. And one of those ways is you're not to make idols to bow down to. I'm an invisible God in that sense. I'm spirit. You can't see me in that way. But the reality is, the heart of pagan religions around them was that they wanted to be able to do various acts of service or sacrifices and some really perverse things in order to get the attention of or the blessing of the gods. Well, that's not really all that foreign today. In his book, Generation X Christian, it's a book about younger Christians who are walking away from Christianity. The author, Drew Dyke, relates an interview with a young man who left Christianity to join the Wicca religion. Wicca is paganism, kind of, magic, witchcraft, polytheist, lots of different gods. But the heart of it, aside from understanding all that, I want you to listen to this. The person being interviewed is a man who changed his name to Morning Hawk Apollo. I guess that's kind of a common thing in Wicca to change your name. And he discussed his rejection of Christianity with openness. He said this: ultimately, why I left is that the Christian God demands that you submit to his will. In Wicca, it's just the other way around. Your will is paramount. We believe in gods and goddesses, but the deities, the gods we choose to serve, are based on our wills. Do you see what's happening? Now, we're going to pick and choose the ones that serve our purposes. And so God starts out by saying, no, that's not how this works. I am God. I made you in my image. I've not asked you to make me in your image. And so he sets the boundaries. And as a result, go back to your insert. It says that God then is jealous. Or another way of saying it is zealous. And that has to do with marital or marriage fidelity. But let me just pause for a second. Does it bother you, the notion that God would be jealous? Some of us think of that in terms of, when somebody is jealous, it seems petty. It seems like they are immature, or it just seems really self-focused. Well, that would be true if it was an immature jealousy. But I want you to think of it in terms of a marriage. Is it inappropriate for a wife to be jealous if her husband is developing a relationship with another woman? And we would go, of course not. You have every right to be jealous, to be upset about it, to be passionate about that, because it's not okay. That's the heart of God's jealousy. I'm the only God. And for you to bow down to some other God or to go in a different direction or put anything before me is to stir up that jealousy, because I am the one that you are to be faithful to. And so God longs for us to be in relationship because he knows what's best for us. In the long run, it's what's best for all of us if we're faithful to him. But there's another part of this that I want to highlight where it says that God will basically kind of come against an individual who is not faithful to him or hates him to the third, fourth generation. What's they mean by that? Does that mean that, one guy messes it up and then the subsequent generations, they're just kind of doomed? By the same token, he says, on the other hand, if you're faithful to me and you love me, I'll bless your generations for 1,000 generations. Well, first of all, I want you to understand that those are extreme. One is to show how extremely a God of blessing he is, because 1,000 is a whole lot more than 3 or 4. But the 3 or 4 is not a way of saying if you're somehow in that category, there's no hope for you. But that in the ancient world, a household often consisted of at least 3 or 4 generations. So that one household, they all lived under the same tent, so to speak. And that unfaithfulness on the part of the leader of that group had consequences for everybody else in that house. And we think of that today when a mother or a father has an addiction or is abusive. Well, that doesn't stop with them. It is passed along. The impacts of that are passed along. It doesn't mean that things can't ever be corrected or righted. It just says that there really are consequences to one person's wrong choice. But God is saying, on the other hand, there are amazing blessings that go with one person's faithfulness as well. Let's continue on in verse 7. He says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now, what's he talking about here? We'll go to your insert, and the first thing is this, that the Lord's name was not to be used as a magic mantra. That if I just say the Lord's name, I speak it out, that magic things happen. Not only that, but to use the Lord's name meant that you would be faithful to all that his name represented, to his very character. So when Yahweh is explaining himself or revealing himself, his name represents all of who he is. And so to use the name of God, it was not appropriate to use his name, but then to behave in a way that was opposite of God's character. In other words, I can't just say, it would be today like saying, oh yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus, and then to live the rest of the week exactly the way you want to live. That's to take the name of the Lord in vain. And that should give us pause, because sometimes we think it's simply about using the name in saying OMG, or saying something that would express God's name. And I just want to say, I think that covers it too. I don't think we're supposed to just loosely use the name of the Lord. By the same token, what's amazing to me is how much, whether in movies or in our culture, how much the name of Jesus is used as a curse word. You never hear Muhammad's name used that way. You definitely don't hear Allah or oh my Buddha or any other. But for some reason, the name of God and the name of Jesus in particular has been twisted at times into a curse word. And so I think by an appropriate application, it's something that we need to be thoughtful about. But it's not just the use of the name. In fact, by the way, the Jewish people became so concerned that they would misuse the name of Yahweh that they took it to the extreme. In fact, they would only pronounce it one time of year on the day of the Day of Atonement. The high priest might use it, but other than that, they would insert another name. And so, I'm not confident that was what God had intended. That it was such an important thing that you would never use his name, because he'd revealed himself personally. But by the same token, they understood what it meant to respect. And so today in our culture, I think we need to be careful to respect as well. Let's go to verse 8. He starts to shift the focus here from how to worship God, and now he moves to some practical things. In verse 8, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Now, in this context, there's no focus on worship per se, even though I think that develops there. But the heart of Sabbath was rest. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he made it holy. Go back to your insert. What's interesting to me is that here God, through Moses, draws our attention to creation. So that Sabbath is tied to creation order. This is what it means, in other words, to be human. God is not only telling them how to worship him, he's telling them how to be. In other words, we are not human doings, we are human beings. Sabbath was made for man. In fact, later on in the New Testament in Mark, see, by then the debate had become, what are all the things we're supposed to do on the Sabbath and not supposed to do on the Sabbath? And they became very legalistic about exactly how far they're supposed to walk and about what they're supposed to lift. And in fact, do you not understand then why Jesus did many of his miracles on the Sabbath? And why he worked up the ire of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, going, how dare you do a miracle on the Sabbath? And Jesus was trying to draw their attention and go, then you misunderstand the Sabbath. If your donkey fell into a hole on the Sabbath, you have every right to help save your donkey out of that hole. That's appropriate. Here is a child of God who who is crippled, who is lame, who has leprosy, and I am healing them. I'm setting them free from whatever demonic influence in their life or possession. And yet you're concerned about what the day looks like? And so he goes on to say in Mark that man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man, to give rest. In fact, it says here, it's not only the Israelites, but the slaves from other places that would be a part of their community. Even the animals were to rest. In other words, he's saying, this is tied into how I've wired you, how I've made humanity. Humanity needs rest. And when we don't do that, the world becomes chaotic. Verse 12, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And now we move from more so from focus of God and Sabbath to others. It starts to expand out this way to community. And he begins by the focus on honoring of parents. It's central. It's core to community and identity and security. It begins with respect of our elders. You see, in the ancient world, they didn't have Social Security. The social care network was the family. And so God is saying, I want this to be interwoven into your community, that you care for your parents, that you honor them, and that doesn't just begin and end when you leave the home, because in the ancient world, you continued to often live very much in the same community. You're to make sure that they're provided for. And one of the ways that this blesses you and allows you to live long in the land is because as your children watch you do this, they will do the same for you when it gets to be your turn. And there'll be blessings that are a part of that. But here's the other thing. If a person won't honor those closest to them, particularly the parents in their lives, then they will not honor God or other authority either. That when children don't learn respect and honor, it's hard for them to know what respect and honor looks like in society. It's hard for them to understand what respect and honor look like in relationship to God, because like it or not, most children's, I'd say all children's development of their understanding of God starts with mom and dad, particularly dad. I know we're in a society that says, the whole male-female thing, I'm not so sure. Just saying, that's just the way it is. And that if we mess that up, we end up messing up potentially or impacting down the road what it looks like for our children to love and to honor and obey our Father in heaven. So here's the thing. What God is saying is, I'm trying to establish some core basic values that if you'll keep to these, you'll do well. But whenever God's people or whenever the broader culture that we see in the world today doesn't do that, look what happens. In fact, we'll see this. Let's take a look at the next verse 13. Here's really the heart of what happens, I think, in a culture that stops respecting. You shall not murder. In other words, he says life has value. When we stop respecting the things that are most valuable, the parents and the relationships in our lives, the community around us, we stop valuing life, then the world starts to unravel. Now, some of you may say, well, but doesn't the Old Testament talk about capital punishment? How does that jive with don't murder and then capital punishment? I just want to say, the reality is that capital punishment was actually a way of honoring life. Because the initial, there were several things that fell under the idea of capital punishment, the death penalty, but the first one was to take another life. For a person to take another life of somebody made in the image of God, their life was to be taken as well. It was a respect for life, not a demeaning of life. To say that's not okay. And so God is setting up boundaries even as he does this. So let's go back to our insert. When life has little value, society, the world, and all of creation becomes chaos. We start to see lives as expendable, whether it's in abortion, or lives as expendable as they get to different ages of inability to care for themselves. And it becomes expensive. I understand there's a move right now in Canada, and I say Canada because Canada is maybe a step ahead of us in some things, not in a good way, but or maybe a step down in some ways. They're debating and discussing about mature minors, that is, somebody who's not of age, what we typically think of as age to be able to make a decision for themselves, to make a decision about euthanasia if they're depressed. So think about that, a 13-year-old feeling depressed, which is, let's just say, every 13-year-old at some stage, not feeling good about life and saying, I don't want to live anymore, and they don't have to tell mom and dad. Do you see how it unravels? It doesn't start there. It starts over here with, well, maybe this life isn't nearly as important. It's kind of an inconvenience. And then, well, that's an inconvenience. Why not this? And if this is an inconvenience, why not this? And all of a sudden you go, how did we get from there to here? Well, it starts by beginning to devalue life. 14, you shall not commit adultery. And here's the heart of it. Just as God's people are to be faithful to Him, they are to be faithful to their spouses. In fact, the idea of a relationship, a marriage, is really, when you read the prophets, that's kind of heart and soul. As God is the husband and Israel is the wife, and they've been unfaithful to their husband, and so there's this constant language of marriage fidelity. And so go back to your insert. Marriage fidelity, then, like honoring of parents, is core to stability of family and society. When those core relationships and people don't stay committed anymore, then where can we trust it? And take a look at that with children of divorce, and believe me, and I want to be thoughtful about this. Some of you have been through this pain yourself, either as the child or as the spouse, and I know there's a story with each one of those. So this is not meant to be to point a finger in that sense. But there's effects of divorce that we can't fully wrap our arms around once that has happened. And so God is trying to protect His people from those pains, even though He realizes that the world is fallen. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Well, this sort of speaks for itself. Though maybe in different seasons and generations we expand to what that looks like. But let me just put it simply. Don't take other people's stuff. And you might think that that's a really low-level, basic thing. Well, it's not just an issue in America, but there are other places, countries in the world where they just assume that if it's sitting out there, it's free game. And there's just something about that, and not only in America, but in other places around the world, that what's yours is mine. And so God is saying, no, that there are boundaries. It's not okay to do that. Number 16, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. I just want you to understand, this is not simply about lying. We often, when it comes to children's church or Sunday school, we'll say, do not lie, but there's really more here. It's about giving a false witness or concerning someone else that might end up defaming their character. So you're libel and you're saying things that are untrue about somebody else. But here's the more fatal issue. It might even mean that they are wrongly put to death. In other words, if I go to bear witness in front of a judge that this so-and-so did something wrong, think about it when Jesus is put on the cross. People are giving false witness to Him. He said that you're not to do that because it may be that in your false witness that somebody else loses their life. So it's tantamount to murder. Which is why in the Old Testament, God said that the person who is bringing that accusation is the first one to throw the stone. Because if they are lying, then the blood guilt is going to be on their hands. It's calling them to accountability as well. So God is putting boundaries up in order to cause them to be thoughtful about their neighbors as well, particularly in poor cultures when a person could be bribed to tell a lie. It's just saying, no, that's not okay. 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. To covet is to have this all-consuming desire to want what is not mine. Somebody else's spouse, somebody else's stuff, somebody else's car, somebody else's boat. Now, it's not wrong to say, I like that. I'd like to have one of those too. It's beyond that, which is, I want that, I don't want you to have it. I would just as soon take it from, and maybe you're not there yet, but that's your desire. And here's why this is important. Go back to your insert. The law was then not meant simply as an external thing. It was meant to be lived out by the whole person, inside and out. Because coveting is an internal thing. It's a desire that wells up, and eventually, if it's not constrained, will be lived out. And so it starts in the heart. So with all of this as the backdrop, these 10 commandments, let's boil it down. In fact, just as 10 commandments were kind of a boiling down of 613 explanations of those, I think it can be boiled down even further. That if we were to boil down the 10 commandments and the other commandments of the Bible, they would all come down to these two: love God, love others. Love God, love others. C.S. Lewis said, when I have learned to love God better than my earthly dearest, I shall love my earthly dearest better than I do now. Insofar as I learn to love my earthly dearest at the expense of God and instead of God, I shall be moving towards a state in which I shall not love my earthly dearest at all. When first things are put first, second things are not suppressed, but they're increased. So when we put God first, we not only love God in this vertical sense, but then we apply it horizontally. We apply it next to us, to those around us. So we love God and we love others, and that's the heart of the 10 Commandments. In fact, this is the last line there. God's commandments are about relationship. They're not about religion. They're about relationship, not about do's and don'ts. They're about how to live in proper relationship. And if you're not sure I'm right on that, let's take a look at what Jesus said. In Matthew 22, verse 36, I'll go back to the question I kind of started out with, which is the religious leader coming to Jesus and saying, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" To which Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Love God, love others. If you do those things, if you love God, you're not going to kill your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to take his stuff. If you love God, you're not going to bow the knee to something or someone else. You're going to honor your parents. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to hurt them. In fact, look at what Paul says in Romans 13:9. This will be our last passage here. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Wow. So the commandments are not about do's and don'ts, even though that's, part of the lingo. At the heart of them, it's about love. In fact, I want to stress something, in that love is not only key, but love needs to be defined. Love is not an emotional, romantic sort of response to God. Rather, it is a commitment to faithfulness. God is faithful to us in this relationship, and He calls us to be faithful to Him in how we respond to Him and respond to others. Some of us grew up very much in a legalistic culture. do this, don't do that, don't run in God's house, don't step on God's furniture, those kinds of things some of us as kids grew up with, and it made God look like the grumpy old neighbor next door, get off my lawn. And that was clearly a disservice to what God was after. No wonder then why so many young people, when they grew up, said, I don't want to be a part of that if that's what God is all about. But that's not what God is all about. God is about relationship. And in that relationship, when we live in ways that are faithful to Him, we will express that in ways that are faithful to our neighbors. But in all things, the greatest example is Jesus. Paul says that this is what God did. He showed us His great love, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That while we had broken all the commands in some way or another, Christ died for us. While we were unfaithful, God was faithful. And His heart was to restore that relationship that was broken. The commands were not to say, if you do all of these things, then you'll earn your way to heaven. It was saying, this is how you live in relationship with me. But the assumption that God had, even in the Old Testament, was that there would be points at which they would fall prey, that they would falter, that they would sin, that no one does what is right ultimately. At some points we all falter. That's why there was sacrifices, because God knew at points they would not do what they needed to do. But ultimately then we roll forward to Jesus, and Jesus comes on the scene and He says, I will put sacrifices to death once and for all, because I will be the pure sacrifice, and in my love I will make the two one again. See, that's God's desire at the cross. It's relationship. To pay the price that we couldn't pay, to restore the relationship that only God could restore. So this morning as we come to communion, I want to invite you to think of it in those terms, not just as the do's and the don'ts at all, but in a relational aspect of God's faithfulness and love to us and our love to Him as well. This morning, if you're a Christian and you're here with us today, you don't have to be a member here, but we want to invite you to join us as we take communion. After I pray, I invite you to go to one of the tables and grab the two cups and then take some time and encounter a relationship with Jesus as you spend time with Him this morning. Let's pray. Jesus, we come to You now, and we thank You for Your modeling of love. And we just want to confess that we are in ourselves inadequate models of that love. And where we have stumbled and we have fallen in the days or the moments leading up to communion, we ask for Your forgiveness. We ask that we come with clean hands and clean hearts. And we ask that we'd encounter You, not just as a religious step, but genuinely as a relationship as we kind of come face to face with You this morning. And we pray that as we spend time with You, that we will go away from this place changed, that we will look more and more like You. It's in Your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.